So yeah, I'm just going to quickly run through what innovation is for development and humanitarian organizations. It's a buzzword that's going around in the sector at the moment and has been developing for a number of years, and I'm just going to talk through the basics around it so that you have a good understanding of what it is and how you can do it and apply it in your work. So why is innovation important? It's important because the resources required for the complex challenges that we're facing in the development and the humanitarian field are not enough. And so in many ways, the need to change the way that we do things and to bring new ways of addressing issues of poverty and injustice and vulnerability are required. The second is there's lots of technical innovations and lots of technological advances that are happening and have been happening over the past 10, 15, 20 years that are having a real impact on developing communities and could actually provide some solutions for the issues that they face. So there's both a need and an opportunity to innovate. But why is there this big push? What you can see on your screen at the moment is a tweet I got from a friend who was at a UN briefing about 6 months ago. And it talks about digital disruption happening. And on the screen you can see Uber's listed, Skype is listed, Facebook, etc., and how they have completely changed the way that things are done in the different fields, whether it's taxi companies, for Uber, or whether it's movies for Netflix, whatever it might be, they've fundamentally changed how those industries work. There seems to be an assumption that this will be the case for development and humanitarian work as well. And so there's a lot of push for this, both from donors but also some organizations. There's also a bias towards engaging private sector, particularly under donors like de-mystifies and USAID in development and humanitarian work, and it's seen that innovation is a key thing that the private sector is good at, and so can some of the principles used there be brought into the development and humanitarian sphere. So there's a bit of a push for that. Also, there's a bit of a bias at the moment around technological solutions to things, and so a lot of donors and a lot of agencies are looking at tech, particularly digital tech, as a way of doing new ways of doing the work. And in some ways there's a bit of a bias towards this at the moment. So there's a lot of noise around innovation. The recent World Humanitarian Summit that happened this week had a whole stream of work around innovation, and there's the launch of things like the GAHI, which is the Global Alliance on Humanitarian Innovation. And Nesta brought out a book on development innovation 3 weeks ago, which we'll put in the briefing note that goes with this presentation. So there's lots of buzz around at the moment around innovation. What is it? Like many new terms in a sector, there's lots of different understandings about what it is. The World Bank talks about it simply being and applying new approaches to address existing problems or serve unmet needs. The Oslo Manual by OECD countries, you can see there on your screen, talks about significantly improving products or a new marketing method or a new organizational method in business practices. The rule of thumb is it's a change that leads to an improvement. That's all it is. It's literally talking about how we create change and bring in new ways of doing things, organizing ourselves, etc. So it's not so scary. There's a different spectrum of innovation, and I think this is where people get a little bit confused and find things a little bit scary. I think often when people talk about innovation, they think about the invention of something. So they think about Dyson and their Hoovers, or they think about Apple and the iPod, those kind of things. Something that's completely revolutionary that we think needs really technical specialist skills to develop. But however, it goes on a complete spectrum. There's also what's called incremental innovation, and they're the small changes we make to processes in our everyday lives that just bring slight improvements. An analogy would be in the field of cycling. The British team were nowhere 20 years ago, the British Olympic cycling team, and yet came to dominate by the time it came to the London Olympics. So what helped Chris Hoy and those guys get to that? And Dave Brailsford, who leads that team, talked about saying it's almost impossible to find a change that will 100% improve something, but actually you can find 100 changes that will each give a 1% improvement that will make 100% improvement overall. So they're small incremental changes, and in the photographs you've got here are around beneficiary management systems in the humanitarian sphere. So in the incremental improvement was the introduction of thumbprints for identification so that people could prove who they were and get access to the resources that were being provided, whether that was food aid or non-food items. On the invent side, on the right-hand side, is actually the whole digitization of this process. And this tool that's on that photo is something called Last Mile Mobile Solutions. And that is about actually providing people with almost like a credit card with a photo on, and they can use that to access the aid provision that's being given. And that has been a fundamental invention and change in the way that they've done things. But actually, you've got two processes there. One is the invention, which are the big kind of changes that you see, but also you can just have incremental improvements to your basic tasks, processes, products, services, projects that you run that actually do create improvements, and they're actually innovations in and of themselves, even though you might not think of them as such. So what types of innovation are there? ELRA, who's the education learning resource for humanitarian action, they talk about 4 Ps, which are generally used when talking about innovation. So they talk about product innovation. This is a change in a thing that an organization offers. So an idea would, something around this might be, for instance, the life straw, if you're aware of that, which is a little straw that you can use when you're traveling or in areas with water that might be contaminated, and this filters the water through the straw. So it's a product that anyone can use that does that. Another product is, for instance, Plumpy Nut, which has been used for therapeutic feeding and has completely changed the way that therapeutic feeding for malnourished children has occurred. Secondly, there's process innovations. Process innovations are actually what a lot of agencies work on in the development field. It's actually how are they changing knowledge, attitude and behavior amongst their target groups. And so a great example of a process innovation is community-led total sanitation. And this is basically a way of addressing community behaviors around the issue of open defecation. So there's no fancy gizmos or gadgets in this. It's just an innovation around a process of challenging behaviors within the community that are unhygienic and unsanitary, and teaching how to actually bring about good sanitation practices. So that's a great example of that. Then there's something which seems a little bit odd, which is position innovation. And that's essentially about, you might have used a product or a process or a way of doing things in one context, and then it's about saying, how do you take that into another context? Or how do you use innovations that have been, or ideas that have worked in one area and reuse them in another area? And so an example of this would be Levi Strauss originally made jeans that were for manual laborers and workers, and suddenly they repositioned those products as a fashion item, and so actually jeans are now used for fashion. Another one around this might be the work of Disability International or Handicap International in terms of really getting people to think around neglected vulnerable groups in development and humanitarian work and say, actually, we need to reposition our thinking and our approaches around vulnerable groups in these areas. And then the final area that they talk about is paradigm innovation. And this is essentially about resetting how we think about things in their entirety. The biggest example of this is, for instance, the use of cash around social safety nets and those kind of things. So innovation like M-Pesa in Kenya, which allows mobile money to be used, has seriously changed the way that a lot of humanitarian and development work happens in Kenya, and has seriously challenged some of the traditional ways of delivering aid or traditional ways of working with groups such as farmers or people who are needing access to a social safety net. So this use of cash is completely, and the use of M-Pesa using mobile phones has completely changed the way that a lot of thinking is being done around a number of development and humanitarian types of work in Kenya. What these 4 Ps miss, though, is another thing, which is business model innovation. And what that's about is how we do things as organizations. Is there a completely different way that we get ourselves funded? Is there a completely different way that we organize ourselves? Is there a completely different type of product or process that we can deliver and support communities with? So that's the other one that I would put in with those 4 Ps for people to be thinking about as they work on this area and think about it. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is different stages of innovation. This is a modeler that I work with a colleague called Dan McClure on, and we've written a number of papers in this area. And it's to give the idea between that invent that we talked about before and the incremental, what happens. So often what's happening for agencies who are trying to create new ways of doing things is actually inventing a new way of maybe carrying out a process or a new way of doing project design, those kind of things. And the best practice in this area is actually to trial, to test things, to iterate them, to learn from them and redesign. So it's not starting from scratch and thinking you're going to be able to understand and invent a whole new way of doing things from start to end, but actually saying what are the things that we can test and trial to really develop something new. So what happens in there is there's lots of trial and error, there's lots of just putting things together in their most basic forms. So what you might hear about is things like minimum viable product. So that's developing something that does the basics of what you're trying to achieve and you test that. And the idea at this stage of stage 1 of invent is you're trying to validate an idea. You might have had a great idea for changing the way that you do education with excluded young people. So what you do is you test that with a small group, you trial different aspects, and then you say, okay, what have we learned from that? What were the bad ideas that we had in that? What are the good ideas? How do we get rid of those bad ideas and develop new good ideas? What basically happens is that often happens in one context, and often you have a particular set of circumstances that allows that to happen. So you might have particularly enlightened teachers you're working with, or you might have a district authority that has just a little bit of budget for once that year that they can trial things from. So they might not work in other environments. So what you're then talking about is scaling. Now scaling is seen as, so we've talked about invent. Scaling is seen as a big challenge in the development and humanitarian sector at the moment. There seems to be lots of pilot programs that people are doing, similar to what I've just outlined, but actually getting these to be large-scale changes to the way education or health is carried out is difficult. When people think of examples, they actually are hard to find in terms of large-scale innovations that have changed the way we do things. But Dan and I, in our research and in our work, came up with two aspects of scaling. One is scaling up, and that is when you've tested an idea and you're actually saying, right, we want to expand this in the context where we are. So it might be that you're working in Kibera, in Nairobi, in that slum area, and you've tested something, it seems to work, and you say, actually, we want to trial this in 5, 6 slums in Nairobi. We even want to take it to other cities, maybe Mombasa, Kisumu, etc., in Kenya, to try and work out how to work that in different environments. What you're doing is adding complexity into what you're trying to achieve, and that is called scale up. And you're trying to make sure that you've got a sustainable solution that will work long term across the whole of Kenya. And so that's what you're trying to do as you scale up. And that's a really difficult thing to do in and of itself, and if you've tried it, you'll know that. But there are different things you can do around adding in that complexity to enable a scaled up innovation. After that, though, there's also scale out. And what scale out is, it's about, okay, now you've achieved that, how might you use that solution in other organizations, or how might other organizations adopt it, or how might you use that in your programs in different countries? And we call that scaling out. And the key to scaling out is actually distilling some of the complexity that you may have added in so that it's easily replicable. So scale out options are things like creating processes and documents that clearly outline how you do things. Scaling out can be training. Scaling out can be doing something and developing an application, like an app that goes on a phone, for things that can easily be downloadable. And they're the kind of routes you can have for scale out. It might be just running training programs for all your different sites in different countries. But they're different ways of scaling out. And what you've got to do is distill all that complexity so it's easily understood and easily applied in different organizations and contexts. So that's scale out. Then finally, we call it optimize here, but it's that incremental stuff. And so what happens is, even after you've done all that and you've been successful, you've got a new health product or a new way of delivering maternal health, say, and you've rolled that right out across all your programs, or other organizations are using it, innovation doesn't stop there. What you then have to do is make sure that you're continually improving that product, that service, that approach that you're taking. And so what you should have is a system that enables you to do that by continually getting feedback and continually developing those small tweaks that improve that service or that product or that program for your target communities. So they're kind of stages of innovation. This isn't the only model of that. There are other models. So Nesta has a 7 or 8 stage approach. And what we will do is, with the briefing notes of this, we'll provide some links to resources that you could access so you can look a little bit more at this area as well. How is it managed then? So a number of organizations are grappling with this at the moment. And like with many things, the real challenge is, do you create standalone units or people to kind of work on innovation, or do you mainstream it across your whole organization and take that approach? As development and humanitarian organizations, this isn't new to us. We've had this issue with things like accountability, with gender awareness and gender mainstreaming and things like that. So we're actually quite adept at doing this. But a lot of organizations have started saying, actually, we need a standalone function around this. So a good example is UNICEF. And the way they've done it is created something called labs. So they're their own little teams who work on innovation. And then once they've done that kind of inventing and they're looking to scale up and scale out, they will actually then work with established kind of teams and departments to scale those up and scale those out. But the idea is that you have a defined innovation unit, you might have a defined innovation budget, or at least someone with that in their title who is tasked with pushing innovation in the organization. For most organizations, this is the best way of doing it if you're starting out. It might just be someone gets it as part of their job and that's all that they're going to do, or it might be all the way through to setting up a whole innovation team and creating an innovation budget, etc. When it comes to mainstreaming, one of the best ways of doing this is providing training for your staff. Another good way of doing this is providing a small pot of money. So an organization I work with called Toybox, they run what's called almost like a dragon's den, and there's a small pot of money there that different people in the organization, it's only got 15 or 16 employees, can apply for with their ideas about what they want to do around innovation. It's not much money, but it's just that little bit of lubrication, financial lubrication, that makes people think, oh, it's worth doing a little bit on innovation, and it's worth coming up with new ideas because I can get financial backing. Also, what you can do is provide people with a certain percentage of their time to carry out innovation. And so that Google do this. They call them the 20%ers, and they actually have 20% of their time to work on innovations that are maybe outside of their normal day job. 20% is quite a bit for most organizations, but actually having 10% set aside is realistic. Putting it into people's kind of objectives for the year helps it be grounded. And then providing training, and there's training such as this, there's online, which we'll provide reference to, trainings as well that are available, and there's books and resources available to give people time and space just to think through how they might do things differently. So there's some of the ways that you can mainstream. So how is it supported by donors? The past 5 years I've seen a number of donors engage on this. So the Humanitarian Innovation Fund provides both directed grants and non-directed grants, and what I mean by that is a directed grant, as you can see here, is something that focuses on a theme. So they have a whole WASH theme of work where they provide money for people working in the area of WASH. But they also have open grants, and that means if you've got any idea whatsoever that you want to get a bit of funding for, you can apply to them, and they don't have any criteria that it's got to reach in terms of specific sectoral areas or anything like that. So they're one group. The Global Innovation Fund is a very new fund that's been set up in the last year or so, and that's a collaboration with DFID, the US government, and a number of other governments and private sector, and that again is a pot of money that you can go and pitch your ideas to and try and get funding for your innovative idea. USAID have an open one that NGOs from any part of the world can apply for through their development innovation ventures that you see there. And they're just another example. So there are a number of examples that you can see there that provide innovation funding directly. There are also foundations who are interested in it and others. So that's something that shows that there's real interest. And then the final one is the Amplify program here, and that is something that's run between DFID and IDEO, which is a specialized innovation company, and they run what are called open challenges, and they basically ask for anyone who has access to the internet and is interested in these challenges, particularly around education, to put their ideas in, and actually not only just put their ideas in, but be part of a whole group selecting ideas and voting on them, etc. So it's really harnessing the kind of wisdom of the crowd to hone and develop new innovative ways around doing education. But again, funding is available for that. So that's that area. I've talked a little bit about set out around a specific issue. So there's a donor in the US around grand challenges, and they will basically say, right, we have an issue around toilets, and we want anyone to come with an idea around providing toilets that are good for the environment, and that would be directed. Then there's non-directed, and that's what I talked about, for instance, with the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, where any idea they're open to any idea, and you can just send in those ideas in a small concept note and see if you can get funding. And then open innovation is what I talked about just with Amplify, and that is basically saying we're going to open out this problem to a whole host of people to try and find solutions for us. And using digital platforms such as IDEO.org are ways that organizations can do this. But you can even do it in your own organization and just actually asking your staff and your partners to really think through and come up with ideas around a particular problem. And then selective is more when you're actually saying this, we're not opening this for everyone to bring their ideas, but are actually going to be quite selective and target people we know who might have good ideas or good ways of dealing with this issue. So that's when you might say, actually, we've heard of this great idea and this great group who are working on this idea around social accountability, and we want to work with them. So for instance, you've seen Stop Stockouts maybe in Uganda, who are doing social accountability around the provision of medicines across Uganda, and you might say that's a really good idea. What we're going to do is talk to them and maybe one or two other organizations and say, okay, can you help us do that, a similar kind of thing, maybe in India or somewhere like that. So that's selective. There are non-financial ways of supporting innovation as well, and they can be things like mentoring. So it's something that I do and others do, where we actually mentor innovation teams and people working on innovation in organizations to give them outside support on the challenges that they face. We've talked about time provision, about providing 10–20% of people's time, holding them accountable to that, but also supporting them in it. We've talked about labs, which are sometimes actually physical spaces. So at the moment there's a multi-agency, what's called Innovation Lab in Nepal, where different organizations are working together there, coming up with different ideas and products and services for communities in Nepal. There's facilitation, so actually running workshops, facilitating idea generation in your organizations to help stimulate thinking. There's training, and again we'll provide some links to some online training that's just been put out there by Open University. And then there's also brokering, and that's when you're actually getting different groups together and different organizations together who bring different parts of the solution for a problem, and brokering that and saying, actually, if we work together, we could come up with some new ways of doing things. So an example would be around nutrition. For instance, Mercy Corps, who I know are based up in Scotland, there was an interesting example of them working with street vendors on street food and saying, actually, we will provide nutritious content to street food, and you'll be almost like franchisees who can go away and sell the street food. And what we're doing in that is addressing undernutrition in children by working and brokering private sector vendors of street food, but by providing them with nutritious food supplements that they can add. So that's the kind of thing that happens in brokering that may not actually be providing funds, but actually links organizations, etc. together. So that's some of the non-financial mechanisms. But there's also barriers, and there are a lot of barriers to innovation, and we've done quite a bit of research into this area. So one of the barriers is time. For most organizations in the humanitarian and development sectors, we don't have a huge amount of time. And so spending time on what can seem to be frivolous activity is not great. The second is finance. we've only got limited funding, so we don't have a huge amount of funding to throw sometimes at these things. But also the accountability to our donors for how we spend our money. So one of the big barriers is really thinking through how might we justify this if we were asked to justify it by a newspaper or on radio or on TV, spending money on this thing. So that's something that really needs to be thought through in your organization. The other is culture. Innovation means change, and a lot of people don't like change. So how do you work on your culture to foster innovation? How do you reward and highlight innovation? And part of that is actually accepting failure, accepting that if you try new things, you'll also fail. So how is failure approached in your organization? Do you celebrate it if there's learning from it? It's something to think about. And then governance. In terms of charities, we all have boards. And actually those boards are tasked to stop us failing. So they're tasked to make sure that we don't become bankrupt. They're tasked to make sure that we don't end up in the newspapers. And they're actually tasked for the long-term sustainability of the organization. So there's a lot of things that your boards are tasked with which are actually things that don't foster innovation very well. So if you're going to deal and want to move forward on innovation, you need to bring your board along on that journey, because it means that they need to take some calculated risks and they need to accept that their risk threshold, what they're willing to accept or not, may need to change. So they're just some of the barriers and some of the ways that you might want to think about addressing those. But also there's the ethics around it. If you're trialing and testing things, how ethical is that when you're dealing with vulnerable groups? And so Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is a good resource for you to read, they've put together some ethics, and these are simple ones. So innovation is humanistic, and it's about having people at the center of it. It's non-hierarchical, and so actually anyone can have a good idea and can help in bringing about change. It's participatory, and this is a really key thing. It's not, innovation is not something that should be done to local communities and your target groups, but it's something that should be done with them. And they have their own ideas and their own ways of seeing the world, and there can be some real inspirations in the design and the implementation of innovation. So making sure that your design is user-centered, which would be the kind of technical term for that, but really using your skills around participation to make sure that you're involving your target groups. It's also sustainable. So if you're involving them, how are you building up their capacity? How might you, if you're working through partners, how might you be working your partners' capacity in this? So that the skills that they gain on working on innovations are maintained and are actually held as close to the ground as possible. In the humanitarian field, there's obviously the issue of life and death as well, and the critical nature of that. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but ELRA have these on their website, and this was a group of humanitarians who carry out innovation last year got together and thought about, okay, what are the principles that we want to abide by when we think about innovation in humanitarian work. So it needs to have a humanitarian purpose. It's not innovation for innovation's sake. The primary relationship is between the actual disaster-affected community and the organization, and that's what you need to be worried about. That it should be promoting rights, dignity, and capabilities of the recipient population. That it must take the do no harm principle and seek to actually minimize, even if you fail, minimize what any harm might be in that. That experimentation is done ethically, just as you will do your research and your M&E and your programming ethically. Innovation needs to be done ethically as well. There needs to be equity and fairness in it, and you need to be accountable to recipient populations and disaster-affected communities around what you're doing, what it means for them, how they can input, how they can feed in, and how they can potentially own some of that work moving forward. So the question, therefore, for you as organizations is, how can you support innovation? And what I would say in this is there are baby steps you can take. We've discussed a number of those in this webinar, whether that's just allotting a bit of time for some people, whether it's giving someone, just one person, a bit of scope to think about how can we be more innovative as an organization. It might just be getting someone in to run a workshop to help you develop new ideas and develop new ways of thinking. The little things that you can do that will improve innovation in your own organization. And there's places you can go for more support if you're looking at designing an innovation proposal for a donor and those kind of things as well. So there's just some of the things that you could do in your own organization to support innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I've got one question at the moment, which is, why has the idea of innovation become so popular with donors at this particular point in time?
So I spoke a little bit into that earlier, but I'll talk a little bit more into it. So for a lot of donors, there's a convergence of a number of things. One is that they see that there's lots of change in the private sector and in the way we live our lives, and they're seeing that that's impacting communities on the ground. So the use of mobile phones by even very poor people across Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, has just been exploded way beyond what anyone thought it would do. And so that allows new ways of doing things, new ways of doing advocacy, new ways of doing lots of different types of programming. So that opportunity has been there. The second is donors don't have a bottomless pocket, and what they're seeing is the potential needs, particularly in the humanitarian field, as outgrowing their capacity to be able to fund them. And so what they're looking for in innovation there is actually saving money, having greater impact with less money. So that kind of thought of necessity being the mother of invention, there's a lot of that thinking in there. And then finally, it is this kind of view of how do we get the private sector engaged, which is quite dominant. And so trying to get private sector engaged and using their skills is an innovative practice in and of itself. So I think there's some of the reasons behind it. The question is whether it will be a fad or not. We've seen lots of fads in the development and humanitarian field. My sense on this is it won't be, but there will be a period of disillusionment that we go into around it, where it hasn't delivered everything that everybody wants. But I think it is something that is here to stay, and it's fundamental about thinking it's not just something that sits on the side, but it's something that we need to embed in our organizations. And in terms of funding, there are more and more funding pots that are becoming available for this. So I think it's growing for donors. They see it as something that's sexy and something, but also something that can deliver value and address some of the systemic problems they see in the aid sector.
Thank you. I have a question from our participants. I'm just going to unmute. Hi, with sort of linked into this idea of saving money, I wondered, do you find that donors have a preference between directed and non-directed funding? So are you finding that funding for innovation is becoming donor-led, or is it more needs-led?
Yeah, so I would say that the general trend for most of the donors is they start open and then get more and more directed. So that generally, as the donors are coming into this field, that's what they do. So I'll use the Humanitarian Innovation Fund as an example because it's one of the oldest. They started out with just open grants, and then they were realizing actually there are other issues out there that we want to start directing. So the WASH work that they actually did a survey of what the biggest needs were around WASH, and then they honed those down into 4 or 5 areas that they wanted to focus on, and then they became very directed in what they were looking for, and so their calls for ideas and proposals were very, very specific. So there are still a number of open calls which you can pitch any idea into, but there are, I think, more and more directed calls that come out as well. So it's a bit of a balance at the moment and a mix, but certainly I think if there's a trend, it would be from more open to more directed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian, for your time, for developing this webinar, and thank you to everyone for attending. See you at the next one.
Thank you.